Welcome to the Extreme Underground, the show where I take a look at some of the most disturbing and controversial films in the world of cinema. Today I'll be taking a look at Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Directed by John McNaughton, starring Tracy Arnold, Tom Towles, and Michael Rooker as Henry. Loosely based on real-life serial killers Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole.
Look at Henry. He's pleasant, he's non-threatening, and actually a killing machine.
This movie is about Henry, a drifter who's a serial killer who lives with Otis, someone he met in jail. Otis's sister Becky comes to live with the two, and things go downhill. Before we get into this, I do want to give a shout out to Mitchell Smith Long, who recommended this over on Patreon for our sister site, Bloodbath & Beyond. This is a movie I've seen several times over the years, and it's become pretty prolific in the way that it shows serial killers from a different point of view. This isn't just a slasher and you see Henry going and murdering a bunch of people. It's about getting into the mind of Henry and trying to figure out why he's doing what he's doing and how what he does influences the people around him. This movie starts off with Henry driving around. It intercuts this footage with scenes from his murders. It doesn't show the kills, but it does play the audio as the camera zooms in to the remains of his victims. We see Henry just going on with his day, and in similar fashion to someone like Ted Bundy, Henry comes off as a nice guy, although after he leaves, we see more of the path of his destruction. He picks up a hitchhiker who has a guitar. It then cuts to Otis, who is basically the opposite of Henry. He's just an asshole in every regard, and he's going to pick up his sister Becky at the airport. And you can see the contrast right here from Henry being a nice guy to Otis telling his sister she looks terrible.
You look terrible.
Henry comes home and there seems to be some kind of immediate attraction between Henry and Becky. He gives Otis a brand new guitar, so we know he just came back from the murder of that hitchhiker he picked up moments ago. Henry being a drifter, he's had some odd jobs, but he was recently an exterminator. His boss allows him to take his pesticides home. Henry sees his next victim, follows her home and stakes her out a bit. He waits for the perfect time and he uses that extermination gear to manipulate his way into the house where he can murder without the threat of being caught. Otis lets Becky know they met in jail and that Henry was in jail because he murdered his mother.
He killed his mama. Don't you ever tell him I told you.
Becky and Henry decide to sit down and bond a little. She shares some details of the sexual abuse from her father.
And he told me that he had a right because he was my daddy and I was his daughter.
This is where you can kind of see the cracks in Henry's character because he almost doesn't care.
Didn't get along with your daddy, huh?
Becky then asks about Henry's mother and if and why he killed her. Henry goes on to talk about how he was forced to watch his mother have sex with men over and over. Sometimes he would have to put on a dress and watch them, which seems to be some of the source of hatred that builds within Henry under the surface. He seems calm and collected most of the time, but knowing of this trauma in the past, it's evident that Henry isn't all there. I mean, we know that as an audience because he's a serial killer.
I feel like I know you.
But as we're trying to dive into the mind of Henry, this is where you can kind of see how he got screwed up. And this is compacted a little bit as we find out that he's a compulsive liar, as he has an inconsistent story of how he killed his mother. First it was a bat, then it was a knife, and then he says he shot her.
I shot her. I shot her dead.
So either he's lying about the whole ordeal, or his mind is so screwed up from replaying this over and over in his head that maybe things have shifted and he doesn't actually know the real truth.
I thought you said you stabbed her.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
This is fairly common in schizophrenia. A lot of people mistake schizophrenia for multiple personality disorder, which it isn't. Schizophrenia plagues the mind and makes you think something exists when it actually doesn't. Well, I didn't look too much into Henry or Otis like in real life. The way that Henry acts suggests that Henry does have some kind of schizophrenia. Getting back into it, Otis, Becky, and Henry, they're all just hanging out, and Otis grabs his sister and makes a move on her. But Otis forcing himself on Becky is what makes Henry snap, and so he grabs Otis and threatens him. Henry decides to take Otis for a drive. They pick up some hookers, and Henry snaps both of their necks. Up until now, Otis didn't know that Henry was a serial killer. He knew that he killed his mom, but he didn't know anything else. Henry, being the alpha in the situation, then tells Otis that it was the right thing to do, and it was you or them, based on his weird ideology.
It's either you or them, one way or the other. Ain't that right?
After breaking their TV, Henry and Otis decide to go to an underground pawn shop or an electronics dealer of some sort in a very sketchy garage. They don't have enough money, they've got $50, and the shop owner just consistently makes fun of them and tries to get them out of his shop because they can't afford the TVs.
What do you expect for $50? Fucking 3D, for Christ's sake?
Henry stabs the man in the hand with either a soldering iron or a multimeter, and then he takes the TV and smashes it on his head. They then plug it in to electrocute the man to make sure that he's dead. They leave the shop, they take a TV and a video camera. Otis is having a blast using this camera, filming his sister, dancing around with Henry, that everyone's having a great time, and Henry and Becky kiss. From here, Otis tries to get them to have sex in front of him so he can film it because he's a disgusting weirdo, but they shut him down. The next day, Otis decides to go sell some weed to a kid from high school. While sitting in his car, he grabs the boy's leg and he punches Otis in the face. This gets him all riled up and pissed, and tells Henry he just needs to go out and kill someone. This is the turning point for Otis. Up until now, he was an asshole, but he wasn't a killer.
I'd like to kill somebody. Say that again. I'd like to kill somebody.
They set up a situation in which their car is broken down on the side of the road waiting for help. A nice man comes out to help them, and Otis shoots him. Now that he has a taste for murder, he wants to continue this trend. Henry and Otis decide to make a snuff film. Otis is then seen watching this tape over and over and over again, consistently getting more and more aroused. Becky says that she wants to go home. She was there because she had a messy breakup and she just needed to get away, but Henry, being the nice guy that he is, decides to ask her to go for a steak dinner. They have a nice night out, they come back, and things are starting to heat up. Becky wants to get it on with Henry, and then Otis awkwardly interrupts. Henry decides to run to the store to grab some smokes. He comes back to see Otis raping his own sister. Henry seemingly saves the day, but Otis gets the upper hand. Becky then has to save Henry by stabbing her brother in the eye. Henry finishes the job by stabbing Otis repeatedly in the chest multiple times. In order to get the body out of the apartment, Henry chops up Otis in the bathtub and puts him in a bag. Becky and Henry say that they love each other and they decide to go to a motel. This is where the audience is led to believe that everything is fine, that Otis was the real problem and not Henry, who is a known serial killer. It cuts to morning and it looks as if Henry is trying to leave Becky in the motel and he's just gonna carry on because he doesn't want to have her involved. But in reality, Henry hasn't changed. He's still the monster that he's always been. He murdered Becky overnight, chopped her up, put her into a bag, and dropped her off in a ditch, and continues his life as a drifter. This is one of those movies that I didn't really enjoy on the first watch, but now I've probably seen it about 4 times, and I really appreciate it more. It's an interesting take on the serial killer story, because up until now, you would never see sympathy for a killer. In this, they really tried to build up Henry as this nice guy, someone that you can trust by the end. He's fallen in love and his life has changed. Then they hit you with the gut punch on the final shot to show that nothing has changed, and nothing will probably ever change for Henry. Everybody did a great job acting, but the obvious standout is Michael Rooker, because he's a complex character. He's got so many different emotions, he's got a lot going on in his head, and you can see that through both his actions and his emotions, and the way that he reacts to certain situations, or even just the way that Otis talks to his sister. Tom Towles did a great job as well as Otis. He's just such an unlikable person that is constantly degrading, and you're just waiting for something bad to happen. He's got an interesting story arc which goes from like bad to even worse as he slowly becomes a serial killer thanks to Henry's influence. Tracy Arnold also did a great job as Becky because she's obviously been through a lot of stuff herself with her breakup, through her past life as a stripper, and the emotional abuse from her brother. She's finally found someone to confide in Henry, which unbeknownst to her is a serial killer. So being that it's a small cast, it was really important that you cared about the characters or felt something about the characters. And I think they nailed it. And the characters, the acting, and the point of view of a serial killer is why this is a pretty influential film in the world of extreme cinema. And even just like horror and thrillers in general, when it talks about the psychology of serial killers, it's angst and Henry, which often come up. The production value is solid, and the way that the narrative is pretty well paced, because while we don't see many murders, just showing shots of victims with some of the audio and alluding to Henry being a serial killer, we don't actually see Henry kill that many people. So it's just an interesting way to tackle the whole subject matter. It's hard to pinpoint what I didn't really like about this movie. I really liked Henry, and I did think the acting was pretty solid, although Otis was the weaker of the actors. And I think it was just because his character was just so over the the top. He's very obnoxious, he's constantly insulting people, and so well, it does tell the audience like, hey, you should hate this guy, and him being so vocal does help position Henry as a nice guy, so to speak, but it's almost too aggressive. It's a little bit too over the top. This could have been how he acted in real life, I don't know, but he was a little off-putting. While I did like how most of the movie was structured, I think something that was missing was the passage of time. I didn't really know how many days had passed, how often was Henry killing, how long did this progression take for Otis to start wanting to be a serial killer. I think that was important to try and get across to the audience, which wasn't properly portrayed. And I think I would have liked to see a little bit more of Becky and Henry's relationship kind of grow, because while we see hints of it and there is that attraction, it really goes from 1 to 100 pretty quickly. But at the end of the day, it's a pretty solid film. It is a lot slower than most people would expect, especially knowing how much influence this film has. Admittedly, I thought there would be more grotesque scenes because you hear of Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, being so infamous in film, when in actuality there's not that many disturbing scenes. There's the snuff scene, there's the rape scene, and there's the dismemberment of Otis's body. But aside from that, there's still images of people that have been abused and killed, but doesn't quite hit the same as some of the other films that came after it. It's certainly hard to judge a movie that was a predecessor of things that we've come to love over the years, but it's definitely hard to be objective when it comes to that. So I'm gonna give this 3.5 pawn shop insults out of 5.
Don't give me sorry, you dumbass. Did I stutter? Give me the $50 and get out!
As always, thank you for watching. Like this video and comment below with your thoughts on the film if you've seen it. If you haven't and you do want to check it out, links are in the description. And if this is your first time here, make sure you subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with everything Extreme Underground.